Hi, I'm Selena Lovett, and I'm here with Michael Swanwick, who is a Hugo Award-winning science fiction and fantasy author. And for readers unfamiliar with your work, Michael, how would you describe what you write?
Well, the
I
late
know.
Gardner Dozois called me a chameleon. Um, I write in a lot of different styles, and I write a lot of different kinds of fiction. I've written things as long as my fantasy trilogy, and I've written I've written things as short as flash fiction. I've got, I think, 10 novels now, an equal number of short story collections, 150 short stories, and an uncountable number of flash fictions because it turns out that's very easy for me to write.
Aha. Okay. Now, what can people expect from your newest endeavor?
Well, this is the Iron Dragon's Mother, and this completes a trilogy of three standalone novels that I began 25 years before.
Right.
Um, I began with the Iron Dragon's Daughter, which was about a girl who's been captured by the elves and forced to work in a factory uh, building iron dragons. They're war weapons and they are appropriately evil. And then she escapes and things get worse. She winds up in high school to begin with. Um, and that was all about a girl who's really trying to find a place in the world where there is no place for her at all. And it had a happy ending. At the end of the book, um, she returns to our world and she moves to Pittsburgh and she becomes a chemist. And this actually annoyed a lot of people back then because in a fantasy, you're supposed to end up as the queen of the world. And I thought, Pittsburgh is a great city, and chemists are really great people, and they have terrific, interesting, involving, and important jobs. But so uh, I finished that novel. I didn't expect to write any more. People would ask me if I was going to write more. I say no. She escaped. I'm not going to put her back into Fairy, which she hated. Uh, but then 10 years later, um, an editor hit me up for a story about dragons, and the first chapter of a novel popped into my head. So I wrote The Dragons of Babel, which I wrote to be um, kind of an anti-fantasy. I made up a list of all the things that fantasy was and did and was appropriate to them, and I reversed them. So the Will LeFay, who is the protagonist of the second book, uh, he's a young, basically farm boy, and instead of being naive and simplistic as they always start out, he was smart as a whip. And every
Mhm.
time that a trap is set for him, he sees it and he has to respond appropriately. And of course, as happens in these novels, he finds out that he is the king of the world, and this is bad news. He does not embrace his fate, and at the end, he manages to escape it. uh, which I felt, all these fantasies that glorify kings and queens are anathema to me because I'm a small d Democrat. I believe in our system of governance. I believe that rule by kings and queens and such is an evil thing, and uh, and so I wrote a fantasy that supports my own beliefs. But then I had before I had like a fantasy novel. But when you have, and that's just a novel. But when you have two fantasy novels, that's an uncompleted trilogy. So I spent the next 15 years looking for a final novel, final theme. Well, I wrote other novels, but for a third book that would end up the series appropriately and would feel good about that. And finally, oddly enough, uh, I decided. Uh, well, what happened was I was giving a lecture at Annapolis,
Mhm.
and there were all these undergraduates, midshipmen there, and I was noticing the woman in particular because they were all very tightly wound. They were all like very ambitious and very under a great deal of pressure. It struck me,
Mhm.
and I thought these were really interesting people. I thought it'd be really interesting to write about one of them. And uh, so immediately I leapt into action and thought about it for a couple of years. and and uh, and then I realized one of the great themes of the world is the relationship of women and their mothers. So I said I could write about her relationship with her mother, and that became the theme of the novel. I will not give away the plot of the novel, but I'll give away the beginning. Is Caitlin of House Saint Merci, an aristocratic uh, descendant of changelings, um, is on a dragon raid of into our world. They steal the souls of children, and by accident, the soul or essence of an old woman who's dying in the hospital is caught and winds up in her head. So from that point on, she has a second mother to give her helpful advice and to give her honest opinion of the kind of men she finds attractive. uh, and uh, and I kept working the theme. And she has also her biological mother. She has her adopted mother who's trying to kill her. Um, I think by the end, I worked out that she had seven mothers by the end of the novel, all of different sorts. Uh, and I found it a richly rewarding theme. I was really happy with this novel. One thing that I did in it was very consciously was I realized this is uh, this is a matriarchal universe. It's ruled over by the goddess. Their society is still pretty sexist, but the natural order is to be run by women. And I set out to see if I could make woman the default gender. So in old science fiction novels, you'd have one or maybe two um, women in the entire novel. You have the love interest, and then you might have a villainess, and that was if you're lucky. Everybody else would be male, because they had to be engineers and plumbers and such, and those are all male roles. I said, let's just make it. If there's a reason for a character to be male, he will be male, but otherwise, she's female. And and I found that it was not as easy as you would think. I was forever going. Uh, I was writing a conversation with the bus driver. I stopped and said, "Why is the bus driver male?" And I changed the bus driver female. And what's interesting about that is that when you do that, you actually have to think and ask about who this character is. And then that character becomes much more interesting than bus driver, little placard sign of that. Uh, and I did manage. The majority of the characters are women in the novel. I don't think it's all that noticeable, really. If you treat women like people, then that the fact of their gender is not in your face all the time.
Interesting. Interesting. So, what was the inspiration for your first novel in the trilogy?
I was driving from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to visit my in-laws, and my wife Marianne Porter and I were talking. Our son was in a car seat in the back, and we were talking about fantasy, and we were talking about steam locomotives. I made a joke about the Baldwin Steam Dragon Works. And she laughed. I went on for another mile or so, and I said, would you write that down for me, please? So I recognized that that was a story idea. And by the time we got to Pittsburgh, I had a good idea of the situation for the beginning. The girl who's working in a factory, forced uh, to build dragons, and from there on, it was just such a rich idea that I all I had to do was keep going. When uh, the first time I ever went over, the first time we ever went overseas, my wife and I had decided that we were going to make a child. And people who had children said that you should uh, go to lots of great restaurants, have lots of great sex, and travel overseas because you're not going to be doing any of these things for a long time after the kid is born. And he said, "Oh, okay, we'll go to Ireland," and it was a it was a wonderful experience. And uh, I I was seeing things I'd read about all my lives but never seen. You know, stone circles and castles and medieval churches, and they were all different from how I had imagined them. Um, the castles were a lot smaller. All this intrigue and stolen kisses and such. Uh, no, mom and dad were in the next room. They were very small. And I remember so one church, and there were little tiny violet flowers growing out of the mortar between stones. Uh, and then Maze Howe, one of the great passage cairns of Europe. We were going to it in a little rental car. We went around the corner and we saw it rise up before us. I had to stop the car. I was laughing so hard because it looked like it had been built by a, a race of conqueror hobbits. I mean, it was large, but it was also kind of homey and decorated. Uh, and I at and then at one point we were photographing a ring fort, and this boy, maybe 10 years old, came up and says, "What are you doing?" And Marianne said, "Well, we're photographing the fairy ring." Now, in all fairness, there's a sign there uh, by the tourist board, identifying as a fairy ring. And he looked disgusted, and he said, "Don't tell me you still believe in fairies." So
Course.
I thought right then, I'll never be able to write um, an epic fantasy, a high fantasy. Um, like the people in the British Isles grow up sometimes with stone circles literally in their backyards. I mean,
Hmm.
I saw that. And we grew up reading their books. So I thought, oh, well, I better focus on science fiction. But then once you bring in a factory building dragons, then you're in industrialized fairy. And all of a sudden, I could throw in things I was familiar with, like high school and um, strip malls and uh, and seedy bars and such. And uh, that made the whole experience very wonderful because I could walk around in our world and go to places and then imagine them as being magical places with elves and ogres and such. Um, and it kind of transformed the world. It made the world a fun place to place my mind.
So that was really the research that you did.
That is a lot of the research. I did a lot of book research
Okay, can you
because
tell me more about that?
oh goodness, I went well. I went to University of Pennsylvania library, and I went into uh, the old sections where you're not supposed to go, where the folklore exists, and all these 18th and 19th century books by country clerics who wrote down all the tales of and legends of the area before they could be forgotten. Um, and it was really a wonderful um, uh, it was really a wonderful experience. I could probably I could probably find that section of the library blindfolded by just uh, going and following the smell of books as they get more and more bookish until you get all the small leather-bound books that have been marinating in neglect and wisdom for 100 or 200 years. Um, so all of that was fun. I have, of course, a lot of book research, and every now and then I need to have a new supernatural race because I pictured Fairy as being kind of like America, like everybody came there and they have to live with each other. Um, I think I made a progression through the three books with the dwarves. Um, with in the first book, dwarves stood in for black people because they were easy to discriminate against. You know,
Mhm.
you're short, back of the bus,
Right.
and they felt it. And I was not entirely happy with that because the dwarves were Germanic in nature. And I really felt there should be something African. And thinking over that for the second book, I realized the problem was that how things like elves and dwarves and such make it into our literature is people read them in children's books when they're young. And then when they're adults, they reach back into the youth and they bring them up. So the children's books of my youth, which was, God help us, back in the 1950s, there were not a lot of children's books about Black mythology in existence then. Even if you were Black, you couldn't, you would have a very hard time to find them. So in the second book, I took and I made the stand-ins for Black people were Haints, which is which are spirits from Black folklore in the South. And I got
Mm.
this from a friend of mine who heard all these stories from his grandmother when he was young. And I felt a lot better about that. And in the third book, I actually was able to bring them more to the fore. But I thought the important thing was that whether I included them or not, whether I focused on them or not, at least they were there. You know, it's like in our society we have those mix of people, and Black people are a large ingredient in who we are. And it don't have to be the hidden prince or anything, but they do have to be present for God's sake.
Right. So, what is your favorite research story? Not just for these books, but for any of your books that you've written. Do you have a favorite
Oh,
research story?
um, hmm. I was um, I was writing I was working on a story for set on the train to hell,
Mhm.
and that's because Zora Neale Hurston wrote a little piece called a Dictionary of Harlem Slang, and it revealed things like what diddy wah diddy means. Diddy wah diddy is two stops on the railroad line beyond hell. So when you die to hell, you go to I forget what something hell, West Hell, Diddy Wah Diddy, and Beluthahatchee. It's the last stop on the line, and these are such wonderful names. Uh, and for a couple of years, while I was looking for the story, every time that I went to New York on the train, I would just sit at the window, just staring out the land rolling past me, imagining this was the train to hell. And there were like giant centaurs on the horizon, foundering their way through the fresh kill landfill and and things like that. And it was always a rich experience. And then I wrote the story called, what did I call it? Doesn't matter. Um, North of Diddy Wadiddy, that was it. And I wrote the story. And next time that I went to visit my editors on the train to New York City, um, all that was gone. It was such an empty experience looking out the window then. And that really was part of the research. Imagining things is part of the research. Uh, I wrote a story which was set on an imaginary version of London Bridge, and and that was wonderful. Every time I went over a bridge, I would be looking at it, reimagining it, thinking what might be going up or down the river underneath it. Um,
Mhm.
that's I think that's actually the main um, opportunity of being a writer is you get to imagine things that nobody else has before sometimes.
Mhm. Right. Um, Now, there's something that I'm curious about is the Darger and Surplus books that you've written. I think those are great, and I was just curious about the inspiration for that.
I was reading uh, um, Mason and Dixon by, oh, come on now, one of my favorite writers, Marianne, author of Mason and Dixon.
Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah, Gravity's Rainbow.
Pinchon.
Yeah, Thomas Pynchon. I apologize for that. Thomas Pynchon, and in it he has a great scene where the two heroes go to a kind of vaudeville show in England, and there is a celebrated talking dog, and they meet him afterwards backstage. And there's the couple that are with him, and he's one of them says, "Your dog is most remarkable." A couple look at each other nervously. We don't think of him as our dog. And the dog said, "Demi, sir, he better not." And I thought, what a wonderful talking dog that was. And I thought, I want to write about a talking dog. Um, so I, I started word doodling basically. And I thought, well, their dog was a dog on four legs. So mine will be of a fairy tale dog, on two legs. So I I described um, Surplus standing on two legs on a wharf in London. He's just arrived in the city, and I had this kind of world that I had invented before and never used, where uh, the most of the machinery that we know is not used, but they have a very highly developed uh, medical and biological sciences. And so they have these replacements. And because he needed to do something, I had this man come up and introduce himself as Darger and, and invite him to a tavern and talk over an opportunity to make money. And I got him into the tavern. And at that point, they just took over. And
Yeah.
they just I kept writing the story, and they were like always one step ahead of me. They knew what they were doing, and I had no idea. I was like running after them with my pencil and my paper, going, "Sirs, wait up!" And they were. I should say a word about their names. Darger or Darger, I'm not sure. Uh, it comes from Henry Darger, the primitive artist,
Outsider.
outsider artist. Yes, the outsider artist. And Surplus came from a three-legged dog I knew, whose owner just loved the heck out of him, and he had named him Surplus, but when he was feeling good about him, he called him Surplus. So I stole that, and then I added the longer name for him because that's what show dogs do, and he has and he has a certain claim to a pedigree. Um, and at the end of the first story, as they're leaving London, set ablaze behind them, and Surplus says, "I cannot help but feel in part responsible for this." Well, they were entirely responsible for this, but they and Darger says, "Oh, lift up your sights. We're off to Moscow to make our fortune," and off they go. And this, I had tried many times before to write a series story, to create a series story, and the problem with the series story is that at the end, everything has to be set back to zero. Basically, they're where they were at the beginning, unless you've got a particular story arc, but that's a different story. And um, I put my characters through a lot, so I figured that uh, none of them would ever be anxious to go through another adventure of mine, except these two. And they believe that they are good people who are having a wonderful time, and in this they are completely deluded. But it makes them game for the next adventure, which they're sure this time is going to leave them fabulously wealthy, as it almost never does.
It's great. So, that kind of leads me to a question of are you a pantser or an outliner in those stories?
I'm both. Um,
Okay. Yep.
what
That's kind
what
of what I thought.
what I do is, with the exception of that, where they just ran away with me, which was delightful because that made the whole process much faster. I start with an idea and I think about it for however long it takes. I'll figure out what the first sentence is. I'll write that down, and then I'll write notes for it. And it might take weeks or months or years, but eventually I figure out what the last line of the novel is going to be, and then I start writing it. And this has two advantages. One of which is that that because you know where that's going to end, every word of the novel is aiming toward that ending. So when you reach there, it will feel inevitable. But at the same time, since you know how it's going to end, you can distract the reader from that and throw out little things to send their minds off in the wrong way. So when they reach the end, it will not only feel inevitable, it will come as a surprise. And if you can achieve that and as an ending, you're going to make the reader happy or at least satisfied. But I do a lot of diagramming because in between, I don't know the steps by which you get from point A to point Z. So when when I find myself stopped, I will draw out like a line for the main character, and then a line comes down for somebody who's introduced and travels along with them a while, and then the person leaves for whatever purpose. And I'll do really quite elaborate diagrams like this. And then what they do is they tell me if one person is hogging the camera, and also uh, what happened. Also, if some character has disappeared and is left unexplained for too long. Um, I remember reading a book once, a long one. I won't mention the title or the author. And a group of people were on a long trek across the wilderness, and all of a sudden said, "Wait a minute, what happened to Fred?" And I went back. I kept looking for his name, and finally, like 60 pages before, I found it, and nothing had happened to him. Just the author had forgotten to mention it.
Wow.
So um,
Interesting.
this is the sort of thing actually could happen to anybody.
Yeah.
Uh, but if you're not aware of the fact that it's a possible danger, and if you're aware of it, then it just adds that whole list of things that you've got to keep track of while you're writing.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so going back to your latest book, what was the biggest challenge that you had in writing and putting out um the your latest book?
Well, the biggest challenge was that 25 years
Yeah.
looking for it. Uh, And I don't know. I find the actual writing, although it's slow and it's frustrating, is just really satisfying. So the fact that it's difficult um, doesn't really bother me. It doesn't come as a challenge. I did something interesting, which I'm sure nobody has noticed before, which is I have a female trickster in there. Well, actually, I have two female tricksters, but there's um, and I did that in part because a friend of mine who's an anthropologist told me that there are so many hundred native tribes in the United States and Canada, and they all have tricksters. They all have a trickster. It might be raven, it might be coyote, and then there are other tricksters. I said only two of these, and they're both very small tribes, had female tricksters, almost non-existent. And I was thinking about this, and I found a trickster inside our culture. So I have several stories about her scattered through the novel, and I was really pleased with that.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. So what else can we expect from you in the near future?
In the near future, lots and lots of short fiction.
Okay.
Um, right now, I'm trying to decide what novel to write next, and at this stage of the process is I have to do a lot of research and then write up outlines for four novels, and then decide which one I'm going to write. So we shall see. Then a few years down the line, a new novel will come out, and it'll be like nothing I've ever written before because they never are,
Great.
except for the series novels.
Okay, that sounds great. Now I have some questions for you about being a writer. What's your favorite part about being a writer on the whole writing and publishing process?
Um, having written, being done.
Being done.
Um, a writer named Ronald Anthony Cross, and he had one little short story I always loved. Oh, various strange, wonderful things happen in the story. And then at the end, the author stands up away from his writing desk and he goes to the window and he puts his trembling hands down on the sill and looks out across the night city and he says, Christ, what an imagination I've got. And that was such a great evocation of how you feel when the novel is done. Um, the rest of it's fun. A little challenging because you also have to make a living from it, unfortunately.
Mm.
There was one year when I went on a binge of short fiction writing, and I was finishing a story every 3 weeks for, I don't know, something like 17 weeks. I forget what the number was. But when that happens, that means that every couple of days you're getting validation. Either you're finishing a story and putting it in the mail and sending it out, or you're getting an acceptance, or you're sending in the contract, you're signing the contract and sending it in, or you're getting the proof pages um, and correcting them, or uh, you're getting paid, or best part, you're getting published. You get the magazine in your hand, and so like I felt great. It was like being Robert Silverberg for a year. And, and then I did my taxes. So I said, "Oh boy, time to start a novel," because I'd lost money doing that. Uh,
So,
it's possible. It's
so
possible in the long run I actually made money because of reprints, but
writing short
uh,
fiction is you lose money writing short fiction?
yes, absolutely. You have expenses, things like your office utilities
Oh,
and paper and all that research you do. Um, research requires buying a lot of books,
right.
which um, some of us don't find as big a burden as others do. uh, but they all cost money, and it can add up. And a short story can cost you more than you make from it. And even when it doesn't, still, it's not enough money to make a living by. I don't think anyone's been able to do that since the early 1950s.
Interesting. So, what do you consider the most challenging part of the writing process?
When you get stuck on a story and you have to have the discipline to not force it forward in a direction it doesn't want to go, even when it won't tell you what it is that it wants. The story knows what it wants to be,
Mhm.
and it will resist all efforts to make it anything else, but it will not give you any help finding out what it wants to be. Uh, and that can be very challenging. I've got a lot of half-written stories. I mean, I'm not sure. I think last count was something like 42. And sometimes, I anytime that I'm stuck, I don't have anything else to write, I go through my old stories, I say, and I see if one of them has finally figured out what it wants to be yet. And I'll pick it up and I'll start writing it. And sometimes it just stalls out again and I have to put it back with another page or two added. And sometimes it just sails on to the ending. So there's always more to write.
Hmm. Okay. So, what has been your favorite adventure during your writing career?
Oh, it's hard to say. Having having a group sauna in Finland after a convention there was good. Sitting in Zagreb in a neighborhood called the Bloody Bridge, drinking wine and talking science fiction at a small table all afternoon. Um, my first time I went to Russia, which is a very strange place. Um, Probably my best adventure, though, is a very domestic thing. Um, I had to miss the Worldcon in, I think it was Toronto, it was in Canada, because my nephew Richard was getting married. And in my family, you don't get out of attending a marriage just because you're dead, say. That would not suffice for that. And it was an extraordinary thing. It was in the castle in Terrytown, which is a sort of place that European royalty would have built if they had the money. And we went in, and uh, uh, a and they uh, took the card, parked it for you. As we went in, there was like a couple of French horn players that played a snatch of classical music, like an alarm. And then you went inside, and there was uh, a string quartet playing to ease the transition from outdoors to indoors for you. And and it went on like this. It was the most elaborate wedding I've ever been to. And I think 3 hours or so into the wedding, into the the reception, excuse me. Uh, the wedding itself was held in St. Patrick's Cathedral. 3 hours into this, Mary and I were feeling a little weary, so we slipped away and we went to my mother's room. She was staying in the same building, and we were sitting there having a room party, basically, except it was not science fiction people; it was family. And we were sitting around talking and chatting, and my phone rang. And Marianne had the phone, and she picked it up, uh, and it was my agent. And she said, "Let me talk to Michael." And Marianne said, "Do you have something to tell us, Martha?" And she said, "Yes, let me talk to Michael." so, uh, so Marianne handed me the phone, and Martha was calling from the Worldcon, and she told me that I had just won a Hugo. And
Wow.
my sister Mary had her cell phone out, took a picture of me as I learned that I won a Hugo. And she told me afterwards that this was like the universe's gift to her, because she knew she would never be present when I actually won a Hugo, but now she had. So a domestic thing, but it was very nice to be able to share this with my family, and also, to just there hanging out with them, chatting, being reminded that how much I like my family, which is a mitzvah. It is a blessing to actually like your family.
That is very true. Wow, that is a great story. I would say that's a great adventure.
It was for, yes, it was.
Oh, wow. So, my next question, are there any groups, clubs, or organizations that you would recommend to other writers that it might have helped you in your career?
I had help from individuals, but not groups.
Okay.
I really want to recommend something called Writers Beware.
Hmm,
And um, this is a function of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. No, excuse me, Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association now, because they changed the
Yes,
name
association.
because the science fiction and fantasy gotten so global in recent
right,
years. Um, but they have a group of volunteers who track the scammers who are trying to cheat would-be writers. Most would-be writers don't know the business at all because how could they?
right.
So that makes them easy marks. And there are people who will get in touch with you and promise we're going to publish your novel, and all you have to do is grease the wheels a little bit. There are dozens of ways that people can be cheated. And anytime that you're dealing with anybody and you're not sure um, whether they're the real thing or not, sometimes they are, uh, go to the Writers Beware website and poke around. Uh, I really, really, really hate to see an unpublished writer being taken because that might be the next Ursula K. Le Guin. It might be the next Gene Wolfe. And you don't want to do something that can destroy their confidence and possibly take years out of their career, which means several books that you'll never see.
Hmm.
Um,
Great.
that's a that's a very important function there.
Okay, thank you. That's good. That's great advice. Um, okay. Now I have questions about you as a person. What is one thing that most people don't realize about you?
I was an Eagle Scout. It doesn't seem possible, but I
Why
was. I
not?
was I was young and blonde and had a flat top. Oh, let's see. Where's Marianne? You had this memorized. I had a blurb from John Clute, the Canadian British critic.
Isn't it in here
Uh,
about being calm and balanced and
uh,
I'll find it.
uh,
Ah, here we go. Swanwick's mature voice. Warm, cruel, contemplative, moral.
see, now where was that blurb when I was young and dating? I could have a T-shirt made of it. But what a lot of people don't realize is that my fiction is all at base moral. I was raised Catholic, and um, the core values don't go away. So a lot of bad things happen in my books. So people think you must be a bad person, but like, no, not really. Like the few times that I've taught, I always said, it would be uh, an evil thing to throw a woman in front of a train, but when it happens in Anna Karenina, it was one of the great achievements of world literature. You have to remember that the characters that you write, as much as you care about them, and I care intensely about the characters I write, they're just words on paper. So you can do the most horrible things to them and nobody gets hurt. I think that's important for new writers to know.
Hmm. True, very true. That's great. Okay. What is or are your passions when you're not working? And how do you make time for to do the things that you love?
Um, well, to do the last one first, I remember one time when I was newly married, and I wrote to my mother and I told her that I hadn't done a thing but work for the past 3 weeks. And she wrote back and she said, "Shame on you." uh, you have to remind yourself that, you're living your life for whatever good purpose that is. And that's part of your duty as a writer too, is to live your life and experience it and notice it while it's happening. Um, my passions, my family, travel. I love going to new places and meeting people there and finding out what they're like. I've been to China something like, I don't know, 6 times. Uh, and I am absolutely crazy about the Chinese people. If you ever get a chance to go there, you will love the Chinese people. You will love China. Not so crazy about the government, I have to tell you, but the people there are just fantastic. And in the science fiction community in particular, where I met and so many people and made so many friends, they're all so young and passionate about science fiction and eager to use it to make the world a better place and make China a better place. But it's like it's not a provincial. It has to be us who benefit from it. They want everybody to benefit from it. And my hobbies all involve writing. For uh, my hobby is writing nonfiction.
Nonfiction?
Nonfiction. Uh, I remember I wrote um, a slim book, which was the first biography ever of Helen Hope Merleys, who is the author of Blood and the Mist, one of the great fantasy novels, and a 14-page poem called Paris, a Poem. It's a modernist poem printed by Virginia Woolf on her tabletop press. And I remember that when I was writing it, I ran into John Clute, the critic we mentioned earlier, and he asked what I was doing. I said I was writing on this, I was working on this biography, and he looked horrified. I said, "You do realize there's no money in it?" And I said, "Oh yes, I realize that." He said, "Good, good, good." um, I like writing about writers. I like writing intelligent, uh, non not. I try to write something that's clear and actually says something, and that's fun. It didn't feel that way when I was writing essays in college, but I have a lot more time now than I did. I don't have to finish this essay by Tuesday, and that makes a huge difference. Uh, Now, my wife, Marianne Porter, has a micro press. So she calls it a nano press called Dragon Stairs Press. And she makes small, hand bound, hand sewn chapbooks. And every now and then she'll say, "Swanwick, write me a batch of stories for Halloween so I can put out a chapbook." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I can write. That's something I mentioned. I can write flash fiction very easily, so that's not hard for me. I can do this, in the evening when I'm watching television. And, the only part of writing that becomes because that's really easy for me, and of course, it's the one that pays almost nothing. Uh, and then she'll make these really, really lovely chapbooks. How many have you made, Marianne?
I want to say 57 in there somewhere, 50 something.
50 something chapbooks so far. And so that's another hobby which I get to do with my wife. She was a biologist before she retired, and she worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Health Bureau of Laboratories. She was head of proficiency evaluation, and so when she retired, she decided to do something else. And this is very pleasant for me because when I was young, I always wanted to um, like live in an arts commune, full of people doing creative things, and now I do. Although it's a two-person arts.
Great. Okay. So what does your studio space look like? What does your writing space look like?
My regular face, it's this scowly old man. Yeah, and the weird thing is, I'm actually a very cheerful person, but my face looks like this, and and my novels tend to have consequences. Actions have consequences in all my novels. So I think people think I'm a darker person than I am.
So, what does your writing space look like? Like,
Oh,
do
my
you
writing
have a
space. Excuse me.
space?
I
Oh,
thought you
no.
said face. Oh,
Your writing face. Yes, I see your
my
writing face. Yes.
my writing space. Well, I cleaned it up recently, so I can actually. There's actually a little trail, so I can reach my desk without stepping on papers. Uh, but there are piles of boxes, and there's um, uh, there are the walls are all books, and except I have one section wall. I have things like I have a West African sword,
Ooh.
and uh, and oh, photographs and posters, original art. Um, that relates to basically my personal past. Uh, a lot. It's it's full of strange, interesting knickknacks. Our whole house is. I'm going to take this and see if I can show you. Look there. See the other side of the room.
Mhm.
And I want to go. Yeah.
Look.
And if you can see, there's a cave bear skull hanging up there,
Oh, yes.
and up above. Um, there's this. The bright color thing is a serograph by Mobius, and the brownish thing next to it is a print of an industrial site that was done by Chesley Bonestell. So, oh, and then next to that, there's a cover uh, of Asimov's that has both Marianne and myself appeared in it. The artist was Bob Walters, is a friend of ours, and he painted a tyrannosaur, obviously about to attack some very fatuous some diners. So he invited us over for dinner, and along with a couple of other people he knew, and he posed us and said, "Lift up your glass, look fatuous." I went, and I did look pretty darn fatuous, I have to say. Um, there was at one point we have all over this. We have masks and we have skulls. Skulls are mostly Marianne's, interesting enough, because of her interest in biology, and a lot of them are ones that she found herself. Um, but at one point, Marianne, we'd been married for about 10 years, and she looked around. And she said, "How did I end up in a magician's den?" Uh, and yeah, our house is full of very, very interesting things. I have to tell you,
So were you ever in Africa?
not yet,
Not
not yet.
yet.
I'm afraid.
I was curious because of you're mentioning Africa a couple of times.
I'm very careful. We've got a couple of African masks. I'm very careful that they were obviously tourist masks.
Ah,
You know, a lot of stuff over the last couple of centuries was taken out of Africa, which was, culturally significant. But hey, we've got money, so we grab it, kind of things. Um, so even if you find something, an African mask used here, you have to ask yourself, is it here properly? Is it something that belongs here, as
right.
in we made this to make some money, or is it something that should have stayed there?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So when you're working, Do you prefer silence or music? And if music, what kind?
I used to listen to music a lot. Now I just it's too much. Uh, it's too much effort um, to have to stop every now and then and skip over a song because you can't stand it. Uh, I found that a really back when I was listening to we were listening on back when there was you played little audio tapes. I got a tape of the Kyoto monks chanting, and the Kyoto monks are basically the Dalai Lama's SWAT team. They're just his spiritual like Marines. And when they chant. This is interesting. They chant in chords, each individual. And scientists have looked into this, and they understand what's happening, which is the vocal cords they hold still at two resonance points, and that each third um, is giving a different note, and they know that that's what they do. They do not know how it is they are taught to do this, but they do, and the chanting itself is supposed to raise you up to a higher spiritual level just listening to it. And I believe it's true because I would put the tape on and put the earphones on, and I would start writing, and they would chant. And after a little while, I would stop writing. I had been raised to a higher spiritual state in which I didn't need to write. And after I tried this 3 or 4 times, I realized it was impossible to write in a state of grace. So I had to
Interesting.
give this away. A friend of mine is a writer, had this exact same experience too. He had to throw out the tape.
Wow, very interesting. Okay. Um, so do you have any favorite foods or drink or that must be in the vicinity while you're writing?
I have the really great fortune that my wife is a fantastic cook. So I happen to fall in love with variety. Um, there's nothing that I have to have, really. Um, writing is very, writing is a very primitive thing.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't even need paper. Mud and a stick, I can write. In fact, I do that once a year. We go down the shore, as we say here, to New Jersey, and rent a place by the beach. And every day, part of the day, I'll sit, um, you know, on the sand in the surf, and I'll take a stick or a piece of shell, and I'll like write a sentence, and the waves comes up and erases it. And I write the next sentence, and the wave comes up and erases it. I do that. I'll write a story or two, and the ocean erases it. I do this for 6 days. And on the seventh day, I don't feel the urge to write. And then I can come back home and start the process again. I stop that quivering need to write. Um, I am, however, becoming an expert on cocktails. I wrote a chapbook which Marianne published, and which sold out, as most of her stuff does, pretty much immediately, on the history of the martini. And I did research uh, on the martini, and I found out uh, what was the original drink and the steps that happened on the way to becoming um, a martini. So Marianne and I, over the course of months, because we only have cocktails on weekends, would make each one of these drinks and see how it was. Um, the ancestral drink of the martini, and this is, I think, astonishing, is the Manhattan. And the martini is this cold, steely perfection of unforgiving drink. It's the sort of thing that you drink after winning World War II. And the the martini is actually the Manhattan is this lush, sweet, romantic drink. It's the best best drunk in Manhattan on a rainy day with Billie Holiday playing in the background. You can't imagine two drinks you'd care to have that further apart. Um, but there was the Manhattan, and then there was a version of the Manhattan made with dry vermouth, and then there's another step made, and so on down the line. We made all of them, and every intermediary step was terrible, with the exception of something called the Martinez, which was made with Tom Fool gin, which is a sweet gin. But all these, other than that, all the drinks were terrible. But luckily, Americans will drink anything. So they kept at it until they invented the real martini. It's like there was a thing called the dry martini, and that was 50-50 gin and vermouth, which anybody who actually likes martinis will tell you is a terrible idea. But it was a necessary step on the way to the martini as we know it. So we have what we call the American Martini Lab, and we pursue research into cocktails.
I see. Okay. Um, Writers very often have furry or feathered or otherwise non-human companions to help them through their work. And do you have any, and do they help or hinder you?
We have cats. We've had over our lifetimes 8 cats. Um, Mostly, especially after our son Sean um, grew up, and could be mostly trusted insofar as one can ever trust one's son to take care of himself. You know, uh, uh, we needed somebody to worry about, and cats. That's what cats do. So where is Copernicus? Well, there he is. He's sleeping. Where's Hypatia? And she got lost. Apparently, people need to worry, and that gives us something to worry about. Um, we've had over our lifetimes, as I said, 8 cats total between us. When Marianne and I got married and we united our households, we each had 2 cats, which we agreed was the right number. And we brought them together and they fought the cat wars. Life was not worth living. I have got to tell you, when you have 4 cats fighting in your house, you lose the ability to care whether you live or die. um, but
Hmm.
eventually things all settled down.
Uh-huh. So now do they help or hinder you when you're writing?
Um, they're pretty neutral about my writing, and they don't come into my office for some reason. They both feel that, well, Copernicus will never come into my office, says he knows that he's not supposed to, even though I don't mind. And Hypatia will come into the office, but she looks guilty. And if she sees me looking at her, then she'll slink away because she's done something wrong. I don't know where these cats get their information, but they're absolutely sure of it. It's sort of like a cat law is that if they're allowed to do something once, that is a right from that point on.
Hmm.
So you come down
Very
one
true.
day and there's a cat sitting on the kitchen table, and you go, "Get off!" And it looks at you and says, "You let me sleep. You let me sit here at 3 o'clock this morning. It's my right."
Yep. My cats do the same thing. Okay, I have two more questions for you. One, is where can people find your work aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester? And I have to give a plug to Annie's. You can get Michael's work at Annie's if you call us at 508-796-5613, or you can email us at Annie's at orders at anniesbooksworcester.com. And where else can people find your work?
Oh goodness. Tor.com has several of my stories. And I recommend Tor.com to anybody who likes fantasy or science fiction. They've done something really quite wonderful there. It's actually kind of a magazine slash fanzine because in addition to new fiction um, coming out very, very often. They have lots of articles, very fanish articles, rereads of books, and things that people who like those kind of books would like to read about. It's really quite a marvelous site. And I have some more at um, uh, Clark's World. I think Neil Clark is really quite a very admirable person. I'm very fond of him, um, especially since the turnaround time for when you submit a story and when it's either accepted or rejected is typically a week. Yeah, nobody else comes anywhere close, I've got to say. So unless I've got something that I think some market specifically be particularly good for, which often happens, I'll usually just send my stories to him first because it doesn't take up much of my time. Um, and there are other e-zines spread around the world, um, and that's it really.
Okay. And my last question is, how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness?
Read it, read it. Tell people you know that would like it, that it exists, and that's it.
So you don't have any social media?
Oh, social media. Uh, oh, my wife rolled her eyes. I am on I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter still, and Facebook's where I do most of my posting. I have a blog, which is floggingbabel uh, .blogspot.com, and I have resurrected my webpage, michaelswanwick.com, which uh, has got lots and lots and lots of stuff. It doesn't have, since I resurrected it a week ago, it doesn't have much new stuff in there, but I'll be posting a lot of new stuff in there, particularly nonfiction, because why not? It exists and I can share it. I have a couple of books coming out, but alas, they're expensive. There's The Best of Michael Swanwick Volume 2 coming out from Subterranean. And in the fall, it's actually, yeah, it comes out in a month or so. And there's The Sleep of Reason. And that was an interesting project. Mary, you can check where do you know where the Sleep of Reason is coming from? That's not Subterranean, that's PS Publishing. And The Sleep of Reason, I took and wrote a short story for every one of Goya's Los Caprichos into a series of these dark etchings of horrible people, witches, and gluttons and priests and such. And I managed to find a lot of fun in them. Now, there's something that you can find online, and I encourage you to. I have two series of short flash fictions out there, and one is called The Sleep of Reason. And so if you type in my name and then The Sleep of Reason, you will be able to find it. And the other is The Periodic Table of Science Fiction, which is was published as a book, but it's still online because it was originally published online. And I did that, and I wrote a short story for every element from hydrogen to ununoctium. And I was doing this for a magazine, e-zine that no longer exists, called The Infinite Matrix. But I would publish like one a week. And so there was a time when I was publishing one a week of the periodic table of science fiction, and one a week of Goya's Los Caprichos, and I also put one a month on my webpage. And when I entered a room, like writers would hold up crucifixes and strings of garlic. It was a figure of supernatural horror to them. And I I wrote the Sleep of Reason, the periodic table, because I had been approached and asked to do an abecedary, one for every letter of the alphabet. And I had done two or three of them already, so I knew that I could do that. And so there was no challenge to it. There was no fun to it. But the periodic table of science fiction, I did not know that I could write a story for every element. So there was an edge of danger to it. And there's only one time when I almost failed. I came to vanadium and it almost killed me. I was like, I was researching it. I couldn't find anything interesting in it, about it. The most interesting I could find was that it's an essential element in the diet of chickens. And there's not much of a story in that. And I was going, vanadium sounds like Canadian, but not much. Vans, no. And so finally, I had one get out of jail free card that I had my hip pocket from the beginning. And I said, so I said, I used it. And I said, vanadium is the couch potato of the periodic elements. It never does this, it never does that. And I came to them and I said, boy, I have ducked the bullet on that one. And then, um, I started getting letters. Wow, were people upset at me? They're saying things like vanadium's a catalyst, for Christ's sake. How boring can a catalyst be? And I was absolutely baffled by this response. And then when I was doing research for another element, I found that the periodic table science fiction was being used as a tool for chemistry teachers
Oh,
to get
no.
kids hooked on chemistry. So I had just stabbed every chemistry teacher in the world in the back. And what a terrible thing to do, because chemistry teachers add a much needed element of madness to our world. All of them were the kids who fell in love with chemistry because they wanted to blow things up, and did.
That's great.
so I apologize to them most sincerely.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And if you ever get to the Boston area, then we would love to have you come in and sign a book, or sign books that you're in.
Oh, I'll sign H.G. Wells. I do a really great H.G. Wells. just has to be a book published after his death.
Well, thank you so much, Michael Swanwick. It was
Thank
great to
you.
have
It's been
you.
fun. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.